Sir, you cannot board this aircraft, Flight attendant Rebecca Walsh announced to the 62-year-old Palestinian man in pilot uniform, unaware she was blocking a legendary aviation hero with 40 years of flawless service. The bustling gate area at Los Angeles International Airport suddenly fell silent as passengers waiting to board Flight 447 to New York witnessed what appeared to be a security incident unfolding before their eyes. Captain Tariq Rahman stood at the jetway entrance, his crisp pilot uniform bearing the 4 gold stripes that identified him as a senior captain with Trans-Global Airlines. At 62 years old, his hair had turned silver, and his face showed the distinguished lines of someone who had spent 4 decades in the cockpit, navigating some of the most challenging routes in commercial aviation. His uniform was impeccable, his posture reflected decades of military and aviation discipline, and his calm demeanor suggested someone accustomed to handling far more stressful situations than a simple boarding process. The incident began when Rebecca Walsh, a 28-year-old flight attendant with 3 years of experience at Trans-Global Airlines, noticed the elderly Palestinian man in a pilot uniform approaching the aircraft. Something about his appearance triggered her suspicions, though she couldn't articulate exactly what concerned her beyond a vague sense that he didn't fit her mental image of what a commercial airline captain should look like. Los Angeles International Airport was one of the busiest aviation hubs in the world, processing hundreds of flights and thousands of passengers every hour. Gate 42B, where Flight 447 was preparing for departure, was located in Terminal 6, a modern facility designed to handle the constant flow of domestic and international travel. The gate area was packed with passengers, airline staff, and airport personnel, all going about their business in the organized chaos that characterized major airports. Flight 447 was a routine transcontinental service from Los Angeles to New York JFK, scheduled to depart at 2:30 p.m. Pacific Time. The Boeing 777 aircraft, with its capacity for 350 passengers, represented one of Trans-Global Airlines' flagship routes, connecting the West Coast with the nation's financial capital. The flight typically carried a mix of business travelers, tourists, and families, and today was no exception, with nearly every seat booked. "Ma'am, I'm Captain Rahman, scheduled to command this flight," Tariq said calmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being in charge of complex operations. Perhaps there's been some confusion with the crew manifest. His accent, barely noticeable after decades of living in the United States, still carried traces of his Palestinian origins. Born in Ramallah in 1962, Tariq had immigrated to the United States with his family at age 15, seeking better opportunities and escaping the political instability that plagued the region. His journey from immigrant teenager to one of America's most respected commercial airline captains was a testament to dedication, skill, and an unwavering commitment to excellence in aviation. Rebecca Walsh hesitated, her training telling her to verify crew credentials, but her biases suggesting that the man before her couldn't possibly be the captain of a major commercial flight. "Sir, I'm going to need to see additional identification and verify your status with operations before I can allow you to board," she said, her voice loud enough to attract attention from passengers in the gate area. The request for additional verification immediately elevated what should have been a routine boarding process into something more serious. Passengers waiting in line began to take notice, some pulling out their phones to record what appeared to be a developing situation. The presence of a pilot being questioned at the gate was unusual enough to warrant attention, and the nature of the gate agent Michael Stevens, who had been processing passengers' boarding passes, noticed the commotion and approached the jetway entrance. At 35 years old with 8 years of experience at Trans-Global, Stevens had handled countless flights and dealt with various operational issues. But the sight of a flight attendant questioning a uniformed pilot was unusual enough to warrant his intervention. "What's the problem here?" Stevens asked, his tone suggesting he sided with Walsh's concerns rather than assuming the pilot's credentials were legitimate. The question itself reflected an assumption that there was indeed a problem, rather than a simple misunderstanding that could be quickly resolved. First Officer Jennifer Martinez, who was actually scheduled to fly as co-pilot on Flight 447, emerged from the aircraft to see what was causing the delay in boarding. At 32 years old, Martinez had been with Trans-Global for 6 years and had flown dozens of flights as first officer, building experience toward her eventual goal of becoming a captain herself. She had been conducting pre-flight checks in the cockpit when she heard the commotion at the aircraft door. "Is there an issue with boarding?" Martinez asked, not immediately recognizing the captain being questioned at the gate. She had been expecting to meet her assigned captain for this flight, but the crew scheduling information she had received that morning hadn't included a photograph, only a name that she hadn't paid much attention to during her rushed pre-flight preparations. Rebecca Walsh turned to Martinez with obvious relief, glad to have another crew member present who could help address what she perceived as a security concern. "This gentleman claims to be the captain for our flight, but I want to verify his credentials before allowing him to access the aircraft," Walsh explained, her tone suggesting she had already made up her mind that something was wrong with the situation. The implication that Tariq's credentials needed special verification, beyond the standard procedures applied to other crew members, was not lost on the observing passengers. Several people in the gate area began to recognize the discriminatory nature of what was unfolding, while others simply watched with curiosity, treating the incident as unexpected entertainment during the usual tedium of air travel. Captain Rahman remained calm, his decades of experience in high-pressure situations serving him well in this moment of unjust scrutiny. He reached slowly into his flight bag, retrieving his airline identification card, his FAA pilot license, and his crew scheduling documents. "Here are my credentials," he said evenly, presenting the documents that clearly identified him as Captain Tariq Rahman, a senior captain with Trans-Global Airlines. Gate Agent Stevens examined the documents with what appeared to be excessive scrutiny, as if looking for some discrepancy that would justify the additional attention being directed at this particular crew member. The identification card showed Tariq's photograph, his employee number, and his captain status with the airline. The FAA license documented his certification as an airline transport pilot, the highest level of pilot certification, along with his type ratings for multiple aircraft, including the Boeing 777 he was scheduled to command today. "These documents appear to be in order," Stevens admitted reluctantly, "but I think we should contact operations to confirm the crew assignment before proceeding. We can't be too careful with aircraft security." The suggestion that operations needed to be contacted to confirm what was already documented in official airline records represented an extraordinary level of suspicion that would never have been applied to a pilot who didn't fit a particular ethnic profile. The implied accusation that the documents might be fraudulent, or that additional verification was necessary beyond standard. Dr. James Morrison, a frequent flyer sitting in the gate area waiting to board, recognized immediately what was happening. As a professor of sociology at UCLA who specialized in studying discrimination and implicit bias, Morrison had spent his career documenting exactly these types of situations. He began recording the interaction on his phone, recognizing that he was witnessing a clear example of profiling that would be valuable for both legal purposes and academic study. "Excuse me, but I'm a frequent flyer on this airline, and I've never seen a pilot asked to provide this level of verification," Morrison called out from his seat in the gate area. "It's pretty obvious what's happening here, and it's completely unacceptable." The intervention from a passenger added a new dynamic to the situation, transforming it from an internal airline matter into something that was being publicly challenged. Rebecca Walsh's face flushed with embarrassment as she realized her actions were being observed and criticized by customers who would later have the opportunity to complain about the service they witnessed. First Officer Martinez finally looked closely at the captain's identification documents and suddenly recognized the name. Her eyes widened with shock and horror as she realized the magnitude of what was happening. "Captain Rahman?" she said, her voice filled with disbelief. "You're the Captain Rahman?" The emphasis on the suggested immediate recognition of someone whose reputation preceded him. Tariq's name was legendary within Trans-Global Airlines and throughout the wider commercial aviation industry. His service record, safety achievements, and contributions to pilot training had made him a living legend among aviators who knew anything about the history of commercial flight. "You know this pilot?" Stevens asked, his confidence beginning to waver as he sensed that something was very wrong with how this situation had been handled. Martinez looked at her colleagues with. The revelation sent shock waves through the gate area. Rebecca Walsh's face went pale as she began to understand the magnitude of her mistake. She had just subjected one of the airline's most respected and experienced captains to discriminatory screening based solely on his ethnic appearance. He also holds the airline's safety record for most consecutive flights without any incidents or violations, Martinez continued, her voice carrying clearly through the now-silent gate area. Captain Rahman has been flying since before I was born, and he's personally trained me and dozens of other pilots on advanced flight procedures. Gate Agent Stevens stared at the credentials in his hands with growing horror, realizing that he had participated in humiliating a pilot whose service record was likely better than that of any other captain in the entire airline. The documents he had been examining with such suspicion belonged to a true aviation legend who had been subjected to treatment that would never have been applied to someone who looked different. Dr. Morrison continued recording, recognizing that he was capturing a moment that perfectly illustrated the persistent discrimination faced by Arab Americans and Muslim Americans in aviation, despite their significant contributions to the industry. The irony of an airline questioning the credentials of one of its most accomplished pilots was not lost on anyone watching the situation unfold. Captain Rahman maintained his dignified composure, though his eyes reflected the pain of someone who had experienced this type of discrimination countless times throughout his career. First Officer Martinez is correct. I've been with Trans-Global Airlines for 40 years, and I've commanded flights on every route this airline operates. I've also served as a check airman, training and evaluating other pilots for captain positions. The role of check airman was one of the most prestigious positions in commercial aviation, reserved for the most skill. Rebecca Walsh realized that her career might be over before it had really begun. She had just humiliated a senior captain whose reputation and influence within the airline could make or break the careers of flight attendants and other crew members. Captain Rahman, I sincerely apologize, she stammered. I was just trying to follow security procedures. But Tariq was not interested in apologies that failed to address the fundamental problem. Ms. Walsh, the issue isn't that you followed security procedures. The issue is that you applied those procedures selectively based on my ethnic appearance. I've been flying in this uniform for 4 decades, and I guarantee that you would not have questioned a captain who looked different. The observation was accurate and undeniable. Multiple passengers in the gate area nodded in agreement, recognizing the truth of what Captain Rahman was saying. The selective application of security scrutiny based on ethnic profiling was obvious to anyone willing to acknowledge it. Trans-Global Airlines Operations Manager Linda Chun, who had been monitoring the situation remotely through gate communications, arrived at the scene within minutes. At 45 years old with 20 years of airline experience, Chun had worked with Captain Rahman on numerous occasions and considered him one of the finest pilots she had ever known. Her arrival at the gate with a concerned expression suggested she understood the seriousness of what had occurred. Captain Rahman, I apologize on behalf of Trans-Global Airlines for this completely inappropriate treatment, Chun said immediately upon arriving. I can assure you that this incident will be thoroughly investigated and appropriate action will be taken. But Captain Rahman was not satisfied with internal investigations that might result in nothing more than additional training sessions that failed to address systemic discrimination. Ms. Chun, with all due respect, I've heard promises about investigations and appropriate action many times over the years. The discrimination that happened here today isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern of prejudice that affects Arab American and Muslim American aviation professionals throughout this industry. The statement elevated the incident from a personal grievance to a broader critique of systemic discrimination in commercial aviation. Chun realized that this was not going to be resolved with simple apologies and internal procedures, but would likely require significant reforms and public accountability. Dr. Morrison approached the group, introducing himself and offering to provide his recorded video as documentation of what had occurred. Captain Rahman, I'm a sociology professor who studies discrimination and implicit bias. What happened here today is a textbook example of ethnic profiling, and I'd be happy to serve as a witness or provide expert testimony if you choose to pursue this matter formally. The offer of expert testimony from an academic who specialized in discrimination research added significant weight to any potential legal action or formal complaint. Chun knew that Trans-Global Airlines could face serious consequences if this incident became a lawsuit or attracted negative media attention. By this time, Several passengers had already posted videos and descriptions of the incident on social media platforms. The hashtag Captain Rahman began trending as people shared the story of a legendary pilot being subjected to discriminatory treatment by his own airline. Aviation forums and pilot communities picked up the story, expressing outrage that one of the industry's most respected figures had been treated so poorly. Sarah Mitchell, a reporter for Aviation Weekly magazine who happened to be on the flight as a passenger, recognized the newsworthiness of the situation and approached Captain Rahman for a comment. "Captain, would you be willing to discuss what happened here today and how it reflects broader issues in the aviation industry?" The presence of aviation industry media transformed the incident from a local matter into something that would likely be discussed throughout the commercial aviation sector. Captain Rahman agreed to speak with the reporter, recognizing an opportunity to address systemic problems that affected many aviation professionals beyond himself. "What happened to me today is not unique," Tariq told the reporter, his voice steady despite the emotional toll of the experience. Arab American and Muslim American pilots, flight attendants, and other aviation professionals face this type of discrimination regularly. The difference is that my 4 decades of service and reputation eventually protected me, but younger professionals don't have that same protection. The interview was published in Aviation Weekly the following day and subsequently picked up by major news outlets, creating national attention on discrimination in the aviation industry. The story resonated particularly strongly with pilots' unions, civil rights organizations, and Arab American advocacy groups who had been documenting similar incidents for years. First Officer Martinez stood beside her captain, visibly upset by what she had witnessed and her initial failure to intervene. "Captain Rahman has been my mentor and role model throughout my career," she told the reporter. "The fact that he could be treated this way by our own airline staff is shameful and unacceptable." Flight 447 ultimately departed Los Angeles nearly 2 hours late, after company executives personally apologized to Captain Rahman and assured him that the incident would result in meaningful reforms rather than cosmetic gesture. Within 1 week, Trans Global Airlines announced a comprehensive review of its security procedures and anti-discrimination policies, working with civil rights organizations and aviation professionals to develop new protocols that would prevent similar incidents in the future. Rebecca Walsh and Michael Stevens both underwent extensive retraining on discrimination and implicit bias, though their careers with the airline were permanently affected by their roles in the incident. Captain Tariq Rahman used the national attention to establish the Rahman Aviation Diversity Initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting Arab American, Muslim American, and other minority pilots facing discrimination in the aviation industry. The initiative provided legal support, mentorship, and advocacy for aviation professionals who experienced profiling or discrimination in their careers. The organization's first major project was a comprehensive study documenting the experiences of minority pilots in commercial aviation, revealing patterns of discrimination that affected hiring, promotion, and daily working conditions. The findings led to industry-wide reforms in how airlines address diversity and inclusion issues. 6 months after the gate incident, Captain Rahman was honored by the Airline Pilots Association with a special award recognizing his contributions to aviation safety and his advocacy for equal treatment of all aviation professionals. His acceptance speech, which addressed the need for systemic change rather than individual apologies, became required viewing in pilot training programs across the industry. The incident at LAX Gate 42B, which began with casual prejudice and discriminatory assumptions, ultimately became a catalyst for meaningful reforms in commercial aviation, ensuring that future pilots would be judged by their qualifications and experience rather than their ethnic appearance or religious background.